Welcome to Sleepy Nature Facts. If you are here, the day has likely settled behind you now, and the hours ahead belong to something quieter. Tonight, we turn our attention inward, not to the world outside the window, but to the soft, hidden theatre of the sleeping mind. It is a place every creature visits every single night, and yet, for most of human history, it remained a complete mystery. So let us begin gently with the architecture of rest itself. For a very long time, scientists believed sleep was simply an absence, a switching off. A quiet, empty room with the lights turned down and nothing happening inside. The body still. The mind, presumably, still as well. It seemed reasonable enough. After all, what could possibly be happening behind closed eyes, in the dark, in the silence? Then, in the early 1950s, a researcher named Eugene Aserinsky, working in a sleep laboratory, made a discovery that would quietly and permanently change our understanding of the night. He was studying the eye movements of sleeping subjects, using delicate electrodes placed gently near the eyes. And what he found was unexpected. At certain points during the night, the eyes beneath closed lids began to move. Not randomly and not in slow, drifting ways, but rapidly. Back and forth, almost as if they were watching something. He called this rapid eye movement, or REM, sleep. And the eyes were not the only thing that changed. When researchers looked at the brain's electrical activity during these moments using a tool called an electroencephalogram, they found something remarkable. The brainwaves during REM sleep looked almost identical to the brainwaves of someone wide awake, fast, irregular, and full of activity. And yet the body told a code during REM sleep. Most of the body's major muscles become temporarily paralyzed. Soft, careful science calls this muscle atonia. The arms remain still, the legs remain still, and the body lies quiet, almost as if held gently in place. So here we have a strange and beautiful contradiction. A brain that appears to be almost fully awake, and a body that is almost entirely asleep. Two states happening at exactly the same time. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Completely different story. Somewhere right now in bedrooms around the world, there are people lying perfectly still, breathing slowly, their muscles soft and unresponsive, while inside their skulls, electrical storms of activity ripple gently across the folds of the brain. Now, this REM state does not last all night. It is not a single, continuous experience. Instead, sleep moves in cycles. Each cycle begins with something called slow-wave sleep. This is the deep, heavy stage where brain waves slow down, becoming long, rolling, and rhythmic, like soft waves moving across a still lake. During this stage, the body rests deeply. Breathing slows, heart rate lowers, and the brain becomes quiet and steady. But then, gradually, the cycle shifts. The brain begins to wake up, in a sense. Activity increases, the eyes begin their gentle movements, and REM sleep begins. After a while, the cycle turns again, back towards slow-wave sleep, and then back toward REM, over and over through the night. Each cycle lasting roughly 90 minutes. a slow, looping rhythm repeating again and again until morning. Now, why would the brain do this? Why would it move back and forth between these two very different states night after night for an entire lifetime? One of the most enduring hypotheses involves memory. During the day, the brain absorbs an enormous amount of information: faces, sounds, skills, and small moments. And some researchers believe that during REM sleep, the brain may be quietly reorganizing some of this information, strengthening certain connections while letting others fade, almost like a librarian moving softly through the stacks at night, rearranging shelves while the library itself remains closed and silent. This idea is still being explored, still being tested. Science moves carefully and slowly here, but the hypothesis remains one of the most compelling reasons we have for why REM sleep might exist at all. But memory consolidation is only one thread in a much wider conversation that scientists are still carefully unraveling. There is another stage of sleep that deserves its own moment of attention here, one that we have been moving through and around without pausing to examine closely. Slow-wave sleep, the deep, quiet counterpart to the electrical activity of REM, is not simply an absence of wakefulness. It is an active, highly organized state in its own right, with its own distinct patterns and its own proposed functions. During slow-wave sleep, the brain produces what researchers call sleep spindles, brief, rhythmic bursts of neural activity that appear as small, dense clusters within the broader slow-wave pattern. These spindles have drawn considerable scientific interest, partly because they appear to vary between individuals, and partly because some researchers believe they may play a role in protecting the sleeper from being roused by minor disturbances, a kind of gentle buffering between the outside world and the resting mind. There is also a phenomenon called the slow oscillation, a large rhythmic wave that sweeps across wide areas of the brain during deep sleep, alternating between periods of neural activity and periods of near silence. Some researchers have proposed that these oscillations may help coordinate the transfer of information between different brain regions, perhaps moving the traces of the day's experiences from more temporary storage areas toward more stable, long-term ones. It is a process that, if the hypothesis holds, happens not during the active, REM-like phases we have been focusing on, but during the quietest, most electrically still periods of the night, which suggests something rather elegant about the architecture of sleep as a whole. The two stages, slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, may not simply be alternating phases of rest and activity. They may in fact be partners in a longer process, each contributing something different, each necessary in its own way, neither one fully comprehensible without the other. Slow waves laying the groundwork, active bursts doing something with what the waves prepared. A conversation, carried out in the language of electrical fields, repeating quietly through every sleeping night. And here the story grows even older, because sleep itself is not new, not in evolutionary terms, not at all. If we look far back, past mammals, past birds, past reptiles, we find rest-like states in creatures almost unimaginably simple. Take the jellyfish, a creature with no brain at all, no centralized nervous system, just a loose network of nerves spread through a soft, translucent body. And yet, researchers have observed periods where jellyfish reduce their activity. Their pulsing slows, their responsiveness drops, settling into a state that looks remarkably like rest. Or consider certain tiny worms, simple and ancient, studied in laboratories for generations. Even these small creatures show periods of stillness, of reduced activity, patterns that echo in their own quiet way, the rhythms we see in mammals, in birds, and in ourselves. This suggests something rather profound. That rest in some form may be one of the oldest behaviors in the history of life on Earth. Older than bones, older than eyes, perhaps older than brains themselves. A quiet rhythm, shared across an almost unimaginable span of time. And so, as we begin this journey tonight, we carry with us this first, gentle piece of understanding. That sleep is not emptiness. That somewhere beneath the stillness, there is movement, rhythm, and pattern. A brain cycling softly between deep, slow waves and quick, active bursts. A body lying still while something inside continues quietly on. And a rhythm so old, so deeply woven into the history of living things, that it connects the smallest jellyfish, drifting in dark water, to every sleeping creature on land, in the sky, and in the sea. In our next chapter, we will follow this rhythm into the bodies of mammals, into the soft, twitching paws of sleeping dogs, and into the quiet laboratories where scientists once listened to the replayed footsteps of a sleeping rat's memory. For now, simply rest here with this first idea. The architecture of rest is already beginning to reveal itself. Let us move now a little closer to home, away from jellyfish drifting in dark water, and away from tiny worms resting in their quiet, looping rhythms, and into a room you might recognize. A warm room, a soft chair, a dog curled into a circle on the floor, and a cat folded into itself on a windowsill. Here, in these familiar shapes, the architecture of rest becomes visible. If you have ever shared a quiet evening with a sleeping dog, you may have noticed something. A paw twitching, just slightly, a soft, rhythmic movement, almost like running or reaching, and then stillness again. You may have seen the whiskers of a sleeping cat shift gently, almost imperceptibly, a small flutter across the face. And sometimes, a sound, a soft, muffled vocalization, barely audible, a breath shaped into something almost like a word. For a long time, these small movements were simply observed, noticed, and wondered about, but not fully understood. Now we know a little more. These twitches and these soft sounds tend to occur during a particular phase of the sleep cycle, the same phase we explored in our first chapter, REM sleep. That stage where the brain becomes active, where electrical patterns begin to resemble the patterns of waking life, and where the body is held gently in stillness. Except, it seems that stillness is not always complete. In REM sleep, the body's major muscles are largely paused, held in a soft, temporary pause. But sometimes small signals slip through. A flicker, a twitch, a whisker moving on its own. Researchers believe these small movements may be tiny overflow signals, echoes of activity happening deep within the brain. Not necessarily meaningful in any specific way we can decode, but present, visible. A soft outward ripple of something happening inward. And so, when you see that twitching paw, you may be witnessing a small physical trace of a brain cycling through its nightly rhythm, a brain moving gently between slow waves and quick ones, between stillness and activity, just as we described before. Now let us travel a little further, into a laboratory, a quiet space filled with soft humming machines and careful, patient researchers. Here, scientists have studied a small, unassuming creature, the laboratory rat. In a series of now famous studies, researchers placed tiny, delicate electrodes into a part of the rat's brain called the hippocampus. This is a region shaped rather like a small, curled seahorse, and it plays an important role in memory, in navigation, in understanding where one has been and where one might go next. During the day, The rats were placed into a maze, a simple path with turns and choices. And as the rats moved through this maze, their hippocampal neurons fired in specific patterns, specific sequences, almost like a series of soft electrical footsteps mapping the journey. Each neuron seemed to correspond to a particular place, a particular turn, a particular moment along the path. Then the rats were allowed to rest, and here is where the story becomes quite remarkable. As the rats drifted into sleep and entered their own REM periods, researchers continued to record that same activity in the hippocampus, and the patterns returned. The same neurons that had fired during the maze began firing again, in the same order, the same sequence, almost as if the journey were being gently replayed. Not the muscles, and not the legs. The rat lay still, but somewhere within the soft folds of its small brain, the maze seemed to be retraced, step by step, turn by turn. Scientists have come to call this replay, and it has become one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for an idea we touched on in our first chapter. The idea that REM sleep may be connected to memory, to the soft, careful reorganizing of the day's experiences. It is as though the rat's small library of the day was being quietly resolved, each memory, each pathway, gently reinforced or perhaps refined. Now, it would be easy to imagine what this might feel like for the rat, to wonder whether it experiences something during this replay. But here, science moves carefully. We do not know whether this replay is accompanied by anything resembling experience in the way we understand it. We only know that the pattern repeats, that the brain revisits its own footsteps in the quiet of rest. And so we return to the dog and to the cat, curled in their soft circles, twitching ever so slightly. Is something similar happening within them? We cannot say for certain, but the architecture appears remarkably similar. The same alternating cycles, the same REM stage, the same soft overflow of movement and sound during that active electrical phase. A twitching paw, a fluttering whisker, a muffled, half-formed sound. These may be small windows into a process not so different from the rat's quiet replay. A brain reviewing, reorganizing, resting in its own particular way. Now let us widen our view just slightly further, beyond dogs, beyond cats, and beyond rats. If we look across the broader landscape of mammals, we find something interesting. Not all REM sleep is the same. In primates, for instance, REM periods tend to be longer and more frequent than in many smaller mammals. The cycles themselves may stretch a little further, repeating a little more often through the night. Researchers have noted a kind of correlation. Animals with larger, more complex brains, particularly those with rich social structures and intricate behaviors, often show more developed or more extensive REM patterns. This does not mean larger brains dream more, in any way we can measure or describe. We are not making that claim. We are simply noting a pattern, a correlation, a gentle overlap between the complexity of a brain and the architecture of its rest. It is as if the more intricate the waking life, the more intricate the resting rhythm that follows it. A small, quiet echo of complexity, carried into the night. And if we extend our survey just a little further, to some of the largest mammals on Earth, the picture becomes, if anything, even more remarkable. Consider the elephant, an animal whose brain is among the largest of any land mammal, whose social structures are intricate and deeply bonded, and whose memory, by many accounts, is extraordinary in its scope and duration. One might expect, given the correlation we noted between brain complexity and REM sleep, that elephants would sleep for long, rich stretches of the night. In fact, they sleep very little. Wild elephants, as researchers have observed through careful field monitoring, may sleep for as few as 2 hours in every 24, and they do not always lie down to do so. Much of their rest appears to occur while standing, supported by the remarkable anatomy of their legs, which can lock into a stable position without requiring muscular effort to maintain. The periods during which elephants do lie down and enter what appears to be a deeper phase of sleep occur only every few days and last for relatively short intervals. It is during these lying down periods that researchers believe the animals enter something closer to REM sleep. And it is during these same periods that the occasional twitching of a trunk or a slow, rolling movement of the eye beneath its lid has been observed. Why an animal of such apparent cognitive complexity would sleep so little is a question that does not yet have a settled answer. Some researchers suggest that the sheer size of an elephant's digestive demands, the need to spend many waking hours consuming and processing food, may simply leave little time available for extended sleep. Others note that lying down carries its own risks for a large animal, making short, infrequent lying down periods a reasonable compromise. Whatever the reason, the elephant reminds us that the relationship between brain complexity and sleep architecture is not a simple formula. It is a negotiation shaped by the specific demands of each animal's life, its body, its ecology, and its particular version of survival. The horse offers a similar kind of lesson. Like the elephant, it can rest while standing, making use of a passive stay apparatus in its legs that allows the joints to lock without muscular tension. And like the elephant, it requires only occasional periods of lying down to enter deeper sleep, including the phases associated with more active neural states. A horse may spend the majority of its night standing, eyes half closed, in a light doze, and descend into deeper rest for only a short window in the small hours. For animals that evolved on open ground, where the ability to move quickly might at any moment matter, lying down entirely carries a cost, and so sleep again adapts. It finds a way to fit inside the particular shape of each animal's world, bending its architecture around the demands of the life being lived. And so, here we are, a dog curled in a soft circle, a paw twitching gently every 15 or 20 seconds, a whisker fluttering once. A rat retracing the soft pathways of an afternoon maze within the quiet folds of its sleeping brain. A primate cycling through longer, more frequent waves of that same active electrical state. An elephant standing in the dark, resting briefly on its feet, lying down only rarely, only briefly, its massive brain operating on a schedule shaped by the demands of a very large body in a very wide landscape. A horse, perfectly still in an open field, its joints locked, its eyes half lowered, managing its rest in the only way its particular life allows. Different bodies, different sizes, different lives. And yet the same underlying rhythm, the same alternating architecture, slow waves and quick ones, stillness and activity, held together in a pattern that seems to stretch across so much of the mammal world. In our next chapter, we will lift our eyes from these familiar, earthbound creatures and turn toward the sky, toward birds, toward a kind of rest so flexible that half a brain can sleep while the other remains softly aware. For now, let the paw twitch once more if it likes. Let the whisker settle. Let the rhythm continue exactly as it has for so long, quietly, steadily, onward into the night. Let us lift our eyes now, away from the warm rooms and quiet laboratories of the last chapter, and out into the open air, where the light is beginning to soften and the branches sway gently in the cooling evening. Here, in the trees, in the hedgerows, in the quiet corners of gardens and forests, another kind of rest is taking place. And it is, in some ways, even more remarkable than what we have explored so far. Let us begin with a small bird, the zebra finch, a species that has taught researchers a great deal about how the brain prepares for and remembers the act of song. Zebra finches learn their songs much the way human infants learn language, by listening and by practicing, slowly refining their sounds over many days and weeks. Young birds listen carefully to adult males, forming a kind of template in the brain, an internal blueprint of what the song should sound like. Then, through repetition, through trial and adjustment, they begin to produce something closer and closer to that template. This learning involves specific regions of the brain, areas dedicated to the planning and production of song, where neurons fire in precise sequences, each sequence corresponding to a particular note, a particular phrase, a particular moment in the melody. And here is where the story becomes familiar. Researchers studying these birds found that during sleep, these same neural sequences begin to fire again. The patterns associated with singing, the precise, ordered firing that normally accompanies the production of song, reappear during rest, even though the bird remains silent, its beak closed, its body still. It is, in many ways, an echo of what we saw in the sleeping rat, retracing the pathways of its afternoon maze. Except here, the pathway is not a physical journey through space, but a journey through sound, through the structure of a song, through the small, intricate sequence of notes that make up a melody. Some researchers have described this as a kind of rehearsal, the brain quietly revisiting the architecture of the song, perhaps refining it, perhaps reinforcing it, in the stillness of the night. We do not know whether the bird hears anything during this process. We do not know whether there is any experience attached to it at all. But the pattern itself, the neural sequence, repeating softly in the dark, is observable, measurable, real, a song rehearsed in silence. Now, let us turn to another remarkable feature of avian rest, one that addresses a very practical problem. Birds, particularly those that live in groups, or those that must travel great distances, face a particular challenge when it comes to sleep. The world does not pause simply because a creature wishes to rest. There are surroundings to monitor. There is balance to maintain. There is, in some cases, the simple necessity of remaining upright on a branch, or afloat on open water, or even, in some species, aloft in the sky itself. And so birds have developed a solution that is, in its own quiet way, extraordinary. It is called unihemispheric slow-wave sleep, and it allows one half of the brain to enter a state of rest, while the other half remains in a lighter, more wakeful state. Picture, for a moment, a row of birds resting along the edge of a pond, or perched together on a branch as evening settles. Researchers studying these groups have found that birds positioned at the edges of the group, the ones more exposed, more likely to need to notice an approaching disturbance, tend to keep one eye open. And the eye that remains open corresponds to the hemisphere of the brain that remains in this lighter, more alert state. The opposite eye, meanwhile, the one connected to the hemisphere settling into slower, deeper rhythms, remains closed. It is in effect half a brain resting, while the other half keeps a soft, quiet watch. This is not a constant state. Birds shift between fully resting both hemispheres together and resting them separately, depending on their circumstances, their position within a group, their sense of their surroundings. The brain, it seems, is remarkably adaptable, capable of adjusting the depth and distribution of its rest according to need. And this adaptability becomes even more striking when we consider birds in flight. Some species, particularly those that undertake very long migratory journeys that may last for days without landing, appear to make use of this same unihemispheric capability while airborne. Brief periods of rest, distributed across one hemisphere at a time, allow the bird to continue navigating, continue maintaining its place in the flock, continue the long, steady rhythm of wing beats, while still obtaining something of the restorative benefits of sleep. It is a quiet kind of multitasking, written into the very structure of the brain itself, a solution shaped, slowly, over millions of years, to the particular demands of life in the air. What is especially interesting, when we place this alongside what we explored in our earlier chapters, is how it reframes the architecture of rest itself. In mammals, we saw a brain moving through cycles, alternating between slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, the whole brain shifting together in a shared rhythm. In birds, we see something a little different, a brain capable of dividing that rhythm, of running two slightly different programs at once, one hemisphere settling into deeper rest, while the other maintains a thread of awareness. And yet, Birds also experience something resembling REM sleep, brief periods where, much like in mammals, brain activity increases and small physical signs appear. Some birds show very short bursts of head movements or slight twitches. During these moments, echoes perhaps of the same overflow signals we discussed when we looked at the twitching paws of sleeping dogs. These REM periods in birds tend to be quite brief, often lasting only a few seconds at a time, scattered throughout the night, rather than occurring in long, extended stretches. But they are there, small pulses of that same active electrical state, nested within the broader rhythm of avian rest. Now there is one more chapter in the avian sleep story that is worth pausing on, one that pushes the boundaries of what we understand about rest to their most extraordinary edge. Certain species of seabird, among them the alpine swift and the frigate bird, spend extraordinary stretches of time aloft, crossing thousands of kilometers of open ocean during migration or foraging journeys, with no opportunity to land. For these birds, the question of sleep is not simply about finding a safe branch or a sheltered ledge. It is about finding a way to rest inside continuous flight. Research using tiny data loggers attached to individual birds has confirmed what many researchers long suspected. These birds do appear to sleep while flying. The data suggests that brief periods of rest, distributed across one hemisphere at a time, and even occasional very short periods of what appears to be deeper bilateral rest, occur during extended flights, typically in the late afternoon or evening hours, when thermal conditions may allow for more passive soaring with less active wing effort. These rest periods are brief, often lasting only seconds at a time, and the total amount of sleep accumulated during extended flights appears to be considerably less than these birds would obtain on the ground. Yet somehow, it appears to be sufficient, or at least sufficient enough for the journey to continue. It is a finding that quietly reshapes the definition of rest itself. If sleep can occur during flight, broken into fragments of seconds, distributed across alternating hemispheres, while the body continues to perform the complex physical task of sustained aerial travel, then sleep is clearly a far more flexible and adaptive state than the simple image of a creature lying still and unconscious would ever suggest. It bends to fit the life. It finds its way into whatever space the life allows. Somewhere within that small, feathered body, a song may be quietly retracing itself, note by note, in the dark. And somewhere, perhaps, half a brain remains turned gently toward the world, while the other half drifts into something deeper, something slower, something old. In our next chapter, we will leave the branches behind and travel down beneath the surface of the sea to where dolphins and whales must solve a very similar problem in a very different element, and to where, in the soft, drifting bodies of octopuses, scientists have observed something that looks remarkably like a dream passing across the skin itself. For now, let the wind move through the leaves. Let the branch continue its slow, wide arc, and let the birds rest, each in their own way, half in the world and half somewhere else entirely. Quietly, steadily, the evening continues. Let us leave the branches behind now, and the soft evening air, and travel downward through the surface of the sea, into a world where light fades gently into blue, and then into a deeper, darker blue, and the sounds of the air above grow distant and muffled. Here, in this vast and quiet world, the architecture of rest faces a challenge unlike anything we have encountered so far. Because in water, there is a problem that land never quite presents in the same way. Breathing. For a dolphin or a whale, breathing is not automatic in the way it is for us. It is not something the body simply continues to do, quietly, in the background, while the mind drifts elsewhere. It is instead a conscious act, a deliberate rise to the surface, a deliberate opening of the blowhole, a deliberate breath taken and then released before the body sinks gently back beneath the waves. This presents what might seem, at first, like an impossible contradiction. How does a creature rest, truly rest, in the deep sense we have been exploring, when resting too completely might mean forgetting to breathe at all? The answer, much like the answer we found among the birds resting along the edge of a pond, lies in a kind of division, a sharing of the work between two halves of a single brain. This is called unihemispheric slow-wave sleep, and in dolphins it has been studied in remarkable detail. When a dolphin sleeps, one hemisphere of its brain slows down, settling into the long, rolling rhythms of slow-wave sleep that we described in our very first chapter. The other hemisphere, meanwhile, remains in a lighter, more active state, awake enough to manage the essentials, awake enough to coordinate the gentle rise toward the surface, awake enough to trigger that conscious breath again and again throughout the long hours of rest. And just as we saw with the birds, this division is visible, quite literally, in the eyes. A resting dolphin will often keep one eye closed, corresponding to the hemisphere that has settled into deeper rest, while the other eye remains open, connected to the hemisphere, still gently monitoring the world. Researchers studying dolphins in controlled settings have observed this pattern continuing for hours. The animal drifts slowly, sometimes circling gently near the surface, sometimes resting near the seafloor in shallow water, its body moving in slow, repetitive patterns, almost like a long, unhurried orbit. And throughout this, the two hemispheres take turns, one resting while the other watches, then gradually reversing, back and forth, through the night. Some species of whale appear to follow a broadly similar pattern, though the details vary considerably between species, and much about their sleep remains difficult to study, simply because of how much of their lives unfold far from the observing eyes of researchers. In open water, far from shore, far below the surface. What we do know is that for these animals, rest is not a retreat from the world in the way it might be for a sleeping dog, curled safely indoors, paws twitching gently on a soft rug. For a dolphin, for a whale, rest must continue to coexist with the most basic requirement of all, the need to breathe. And so the brain has found a way to divide itself, gently, continuously, allowing one half to drift into stillness, while the other half maintains the slow, steady rhythm of survival. It is, in its own way, a beautiful solution. A brain that has learned not to choose between resting and living, but to do both quietly at the same time, one hemisphere at a time. Before we travel further into the ocean's depths, there is one more marine mammal worth resting on for a moment, one that offers a bridge between the fully aquatic life of dolphins and the partly terrestrial life of the mammals we explored in our earlier chapter. The seal occupies a fascinating middle position in the sleep story of marine mammals. Unlike dolphins, seals can and do spend significant time on land or on ice, and when they rest in these environments, they sleep much as many land mammals do, both hemispheres resting together, the body still, the breathing slow and regular. But when seals enter the water to rest, something changes. In the open ocean, some seal species have been observed to sleep while floating at the surface, a posture researchers sometimes describe as logging, given its resemblance to a drifting piece of wood. In deeper water, certain species, particularly the northern elephant seal, have been observed sinking slowly beneath the surface in what appears to be a resting state, spiraling gently downward in a slow passive descent before waking to return to the surface for air. What makes this especially interesting is that research on elephant seals at sea has suggested they may achieve more REM sleep during these brief, spiraling descents than they do at any other time. The descent provides a few minutes of relative safety from surface disturbance, long enough perhaps for the brain to cycle briefly into that more active state before the need to breathe calls the animal back upward. It is a remarkable image, a large, warm-blooded mammal sinking softly through dark water in the small hours, its brain cycling through its nightly rhythm in the few minutes available, before buoyancy and breath pull it gently back toward the light. And it shows, once more, how completely the architecture of rest has been shaped by the particular demands of each animal's world. Not a fixed structure imposed from outside, but a living pattern continuously negotiating with the realities of the life it inhabits. Now, let us travel a little further still, into a part of the ocean story that is, in many ways, much newer to us. A story that researchers have only recently begun to observe in any detail, and one that involves a creature quite unlike any we have discussed so far: the octopus. For a long time, octopuses were not considered likely candidates for anything resembling sleep. At least not in the way we have been describing it. Their nervous systems are organized very differently from those of mammals or birds. A large portion of an octopus's neurons are not concentrated in a single central brain, but distributed throughout its body, particularly along its arms, each one capable of a surprising degree of independent processing. And yet, when researchers began observing octopuses closely, over long uninterrupted periods, they noticed something rather striking. During certain periods of stillness, periods where the octopus had withdrawn into a den or settled quietly on the seafloor, its body would begin to change, not in subtle ways, but in ways that were at times quite dramatic. The skin, which an octopus can typically control with extraordinary precision, shifting color and texture to blend into its surroundings, or to communicate, or to express something of its internal state, would begin to ripple through a sequence of changes. Colors would shift, sometimes moving across the body in waves. The texture of the skin would also shift, sometimes settling into one pattern, sometimes moving through several in succession. All of this while the octopus appeared to be resting, its eyes often closed or nearly closed, its body still in terms of movement through the water, even as its surface continued to change. Some researchers have described these periods as resembling an active sleep state, drawing a loose comparison to the active electrical phase we have followed throughout this documentary. The phase associated in mammals and birds with that surge of brain activity resembling wakefulness. It is important here to move carefully. We do not know what, if anything, these color and texture changes represent in terms of internal experience. We do not know whether they reflect something analogous to the replay we saw in the sleeping rat, retracing the pathways of its maze, or the zebra finch, quietly rehearsing the structure of its song. The nervous system of an octopus is simply too different from our own, too distributed, too unfamiliar, for us to draw those connections with any confidence. What we can say with care is that there appears to be a state, observable, repeatable, during which an octopus's body behaves in ways that differ markedly from its waking behavior. A state during which the surface of its body seems to be, in some sense, doing something, even as the animal itself appears to be doing very little at all. It is a strange and beautiful image. A creature settled quietly in a den, its arms curled gently around itself, while across its skin, colors drift and shift like something being projected from within onto a screen that happens to be alive. Whether this represents anything like a dream, in any sense we would recognize, remains entirely unknown. But the observation itself, the simple fact that the body of a resting octopus continues to express something visibly while the animal rests, adds yet another thread to the wide, varied tapestry we have been exploring. And so here, in the deep blue quiet of the open ocean, we find several very different solutions to several very different problems. For the dolphin and for the whale, the challenge is one of breath, the need to remain connected to the surface, to the air above, even while the body seeks rest. And the solution is a kind of division, one hemisphere resting while the other watches, two halves of a single mind taking turns, gently, through the night. For the seal, the solution shifts depending on where the animal finds itself. On land, both hemispheres rest together. In open water, the brain adapts, spiraling slowly downward into brief, repeating windows of deeper rest, then rising back toward the surface, cycling through the night in slow, quiet loops. For the octopus, the challenge is different again. A creature without bones, without a single centralized brain in the way we typically imagine one, settling into stillness in the safety of a den, while its skin continues to shift and ripple, hinting at activity occurring somewhere within, in patterns we are only beginning to observe and do not yet fully understand. All of these solutions, so different from one another, and so different again from the twitching paw of a sleeping dog, or the divided attention of a resting bird, remind us of something we touched on earlier in our journey. That rest is not one single thing. It is not a single switch flipped on and off, the same way in every creature, in every body, in every environment. It is instead something shaped by buoyancy and by breath, shaped by the presence or absence of solid ground, shaped by whether a creature rests alone or within a group, shaped by whether its world is illuminated by the soft light of dusk or by the dim drifting glow of bioluminescence far beneath the waves. And yet, beneath all of these different shapes, certain threads continue to appear, a division between deeper and lighter states, a pattern that alternates rather than remaining constant. And in many cases, some form of that more active, more electrically rich phase, appearing briefly, then fading, then returning again, in its own quiet rhythm. The ocean holds its sleepers gently, in water rather than air, in darkness rather than dusk. A dolphin drifts, slowly rising and falling, one eye closed, one eye watching. A seal spirals downward through dark water, resting in the only moments the ocean makes available, then rising again toward the air. Somewhere below, in a den tucked into the rocks, an octopus rests, its arms curled softly around itself, as faint waves of color pass across its skin, like something remembered, or perhaps something simply being processed quietly in the dark. In our next chapter, we will rise back toward the surface, and then further still, stepping back from any single creature, to consider what all of these different forms of rest might mean when placed side by side. The twitching paw, the rehearsed song, the divided hemisphere, the shifting skin, all of them part of something very old and very widely shared across the long history of life on this planet. For now, let the silhouette drift, slowly rising and falling, within its narrow band of water. Let the faint low calls continue, spaced far apart, soft and rounded, fading into the hum of the deep. The ocean continues quietly as it always has, and so we rise now, slowly, away from the deep blue water, away from the drifting silhouette of the dolphin, away from the quiet den where an octopus rests beneath pins of color. And we find ourselves, gently, looking back across everything we have explored tonight. It is worth pausing here for a moment to consider the shape of the journey itself. We began in a sleep laboratory in the early 1950s, with a discovery that seemed, at the time, almost impossible. A brain behaving as though awake, while a body lay perfectly still. We followed that discovery into the bodies of dogs and cats and laboratory rats, watching paws twitch and whiskers flutter, and listening to scientists describe the quiet replay of a maze, retraced step by step within a sleeping mind. We then lifted our eyes to the branches, to birds dividing their rest between two hemispheres, one half watching the world, the other half settling into something deeper, while somewhere within, a song rehearsed itself in silence. And finally, we descended beneath the waves, to dolphins solving the ancient problem of breath through that same quiet division, to seals spiraling slowly through dark water, finding rest in the brief, repeating windows the ocean allows, and to octopuses whose skin seemed to carry, briefly, the visible trace of something happening within. For very different settings, for very different bodies, for very different solutions to what might seem on the surface like a simple question. What happens when a creature rests? And yet, again and again, certain threads kept reappearing, a cycling, an alternation between deeper, slower states and lighter, more active ones. Brief periods where the brain, or in the case of the octopus, perhaps the wider nervous system, seems to become unusually active, even as the body remains still, or nearly still. And in several of the creatures we explored, small physical signs, a twitch, a flutter, a shift in color, that seem to accompany these more active periods, hinting at something occurring beneath the surface, something we can observe, but not yet fully explain. This is, we should say clearly, still very much an open question. Science has not arrived at a complete answer here. We do not know, with any certainty, what these periods of heightened brain activity represent in terms of inner experience for a dog, or a rat, or a bird, or a dolphin, or an octopus. We do not know whether there is something it is like to be a sleeping creature during these moments, in the way philosophers sometimes frame such questions. We do not know whether the replayed pathways in a rat's hippocampus are accompanied by anything resembling the sensation of running, or whether the rehearsed song of a sleeping finch is accompanied by anything resembling the sensation of singing or hearing. What we do know is this: the pattern itself, the architecture, the cycling, the replay, the division between hemispheres, the brief surges of activity, appears, in one form or another, across an extraordinarily wide range of creatures, environments, and evolutionary histories. It appears in small mammals resting indoors, in warm, familiar rooms. It appears in birds perched on branches, swaying gently in the evening air, or moving steadily through the sky on long, migratory journeys. It appears in dolphins and whales, suspended in open water, their breath tied to the surface above. And it appears in some form, perhaps, in octopuses settled into dens on the seafloor, their skin rippling with quiet, unexplained color. And if we look back even further, to the simple worms and to the jellyfish we mentioned at the very beginning of this journey, creatures without brains in any sense we would recognize, we find rest states there too. Periods of reduced activity, periods of stillness, echoes, however faint, of the same underlying rhythm. This raises a rather remarkable possibility that this rhythm, this alternation between deeper and lighter states, this tendency toward periods of internal activity occurring during outward stillness, may be something extremely old, older perhaps than many of the specific structures we associate with it, older than the hippocampus, older than the divided hemispheres of a bird or a dolphin, perhaps even older than centralized brains themselves. It may be, in other words, one of the oldest patterns in the history of life, a pattern that emerged, in some simple form, in ancient creatures whose bodies left barely a trace in the fossil record, and that has been carried forward ever since, branching and changing, taking on new forms in new bodies, but never entirely disappearing. Every mammal curled in sleep, every bird with one eye closed against the dusk, every dolphin rising slowly toward the surface for its next breath, every octopus resting quietly in its den, its skin shifting through unspoken colors, all of them in their own way expressions of this same ancient rhythm, inherited, reshaped, and carried onward through hundreds of millions of years. And here gently the story arrives at you, because you too carry this rhythm. Somewhere behind your closed eyes, your own brain moves through the same broad architecture we described in our very first chapter. Slow waves and then quicker ones, deeper rest and then lighter, a cycling, repeating, again and again through the night, much as it does in the dog curled on the floor, much as it does in the bird settled on its branch, much as it does in the dolphin drifting through dark water, far away beneath the waves. You are not separate from any of this. You are simply another expression of it, another body, another brain, carrying forward a rhythm that stretches back further than we can easily imagine, connecting you, quietly, to an almost unbroken line of resting creatures, reaching all the way back through the long history of life on this planet. There is something rather comforting in that thought, if we allow ourselves to sit with it for a moment. that tonight, as you rest, you are not doing something unusual or separate from the natural world. You are doing something that creatures have been doing in one form or another for an extraordinarily long time. Something ancient, something shared, something woven quietly into the fabric of life itself. Now, there is one more dimension to this shared mystery that deserves a quiet moment of consideration before we rest with it entirely. The question of what sleep is for in evolutionary terms is one that remains genuinely open. We have explored the memory hypothesis, the idea that sleep, and particularly its more active phases, may play a role in consolidating and reorganizing the experiences of waking life. But this is not the only proposal on the table, and it may not be the complete picture. Some researchers have emphasized the restorative function of sleep, the idea that the brain uses the quiet of rest to clear away metabolic byproducts that accumulate during waking activity. The glymphatic system, a network of channels in the brain that appears to expand during sleep, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flow more freely through brain tissue, has drawn considerable attention in recent years as a possible mechanism for this kind of biological housekeeping. Others have pointed to sleep's role in regulating mood and emotional processing, noting that disrupted sleep consistently affects how individuals respond to emotional information, and that the active phases of sleep in particular seem to be involved in how the brain processes the emotional weight of experiences, not only their factual content. Still others have proposed that sleep serves multiple functions simultaneously, and that the search for a single unified explanation may itself be a kind of category error. A system this ancient, this universal, this deeply woven into the biology of so many different creatures, may simply be doing more than one thing at once, just as breathing does more than one thing at once. Just as the beating of a heart does more than one thing at once. It is a question that may not have a single clean answer, and there is a certain quiet satisfaction in that if we allow ourselves to feel it. Not everything that is true of the world arrives neatly labeled and fully explained. Some of the most fundamental things that living creatures do are still, in their deepest workings, genuinely mysterious. Sleep is one of them. The questions remain open, and that too is part of the beauty of it. We do not fully understand what happens during these active periods of rest in any creature, including ourselves. We do not know what, if anything, is experienced. We do not know what these patterns mean in any deeper sense, but we know that they are there, observable, measurable, present in one form or another in nearly every resting creature we have studied closely enough to ask the question. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. Not a final answer, but a wide-opened question, held gently, shared across an enormous range of life, from the simplest creatures in ancient seas, to the dog curled by the fire, to the bird on its branch, to the dolphin beneath the waves, to you, here, now, settling slowly into your own version of this very old rhythm. The silhouettes drift outward now, soft and layered, the dog, the bird, the dolphin, each one fading gently into the next, arranged in a slow, quiet circle, dusk settling into midnight blue around them. Nothing more needs to be added. Nothing more needs to be explained. The rhythm continues as it always has, in bodies large and small, in air and in water, in light and in darkness, and somewhere within all of it, so do you. Let us step now away from the ocean, and away from the warm-blooded world we have been moving through so carefully, and out into a different kind of night, a quieter night in some ways, a cooler one. Here, on a flat rock beside a slow river, something rests. It is a lizard, and for a long time, scientists were not entirely sure whether what it was doing counted as sleep at all. For much of the 20th century, the prevailing assumption about reptiles and fish was that they did not sleep in any meaningful sense. They rested, certainly. They became still and less responsive to their surroundings. But the deeper structure we have been following through this documentary, the cycling between slow wave and active phases, the brief surges of electrical activity within an otherwise quiet brain seemed to many researchers to be a feature of warm-blooded life, of mammals and birds, of brains with a certain level of complexity, warmth, and metabolic investment. That assumption has been, in recent years, quietly and thoroughly revised. Studies on the Australian dragon lizard, and later on other reptile species, have revealed that these animals do show something that looks, in its broad structure, remarkably similar to the cycling we observed in mammals. Periods of slow, quiet brain activity, and then briefly periods of faster, more complex electrical patterns, not identical to REM sleep in mammals, and not described by researchers as the same thing, but similar enough in their basic structure and in their regular, rhythmic alternation to suggest that what we are looking at may be, in some sense, a related phenomenon. The finding was striking, partly because of what it implied about when in evolutionary history this cycling might have first appeared. If reptiles, which share a common ancestor with both birds and mammals, show some version of this cycling, then the pattern may be older than the evolutionary split that separated the warm-blooded lineages from the cold-blooded ones. It may have been present, in some early form, in the animals that came before all of them, carried forward, then not invented separately, branching and diversifying as the lineages diverged, but never entirely lost. This possibility, still being explored, still being debated, would push the origin of sleep's basic architecture further back in time than even the jellyfish and worm examples we considered in our very first chapter. It would suggest that the cycling, the alternation between quiet and active, is not simply a feature of complex nervous systems. It may be something closer to a fundamental property of nervous systems in general, wherever they appear, and however simple they might be. Consider the fish. Fish do not have eyelids, so they cannot close their eyes. This made it difficult for a long time to identify rest states in fish using the kinds of behavioral cues that work for mammals and birds. But researchers have found other ways to ask the question. By monitoring the responsiveness of fish to external stimuli at different times of day, and by using neural recording techniques in species amenable to laboratory study, scientists have built a picture of fish rest that looks, in its broad outlines, surprisingly familiar. Fish show periods of reduced activity and reduced responsiveness, typically occurring at predictable times that follow a daily rhythm. Some species adopt specific postures during these periods, hovering motionless in sheltered locations, or lying against the substrate in ways they do not exhibit when alert and active. Brainwave recordings in zebrafish, a species widely used in neuroscience research, partly because its genetics are well understood, have revealed slow wave-like activity during rest periods, and brief episodes of faster activity interspersed within them. Again, not identical to what we see in mammals, but structured, rhythmic, cycling. The zebrafish has become, in many ways, one of the most important animals in sleep research over the past 2 decades. Not because its sleep resembles ours in any obvious surface way, but because its genetics are tractable enough to allow researchers to ask very specific questions about the molecular machinery underlying rest. When scientists interfere with certain genes in zebrafish, genes involved in the regulation of neurotransmitters like adenosine and dopamine, the animal's rest patterns change in ways that parallel the effects of the same genetic changes in mammals. This suggests that the molecular systems involved in regulating sleep, the chemical signals that build up during waking hours and dissipate during rest, may be even more ancient and more conserved than the brainwave patterns themselves. The chemistry of tiredness and the chemistry of recovery may stretch back to some of the earliest chapters of animal life, long before bones, long before eyes, long before anything we would recognize as a brain. And then there are the insects. Insects have nervous systems that are, by any measure, enormously simpler than those of vertebrates. A honeybee, for instance, has fewer than 1 million neurons compared to the roughly 86 billion in a human brain. And yet, insects show rest states that share a number of features with the sleep we have been describing throughout this documentary. Honeybees become still at night, adopting specific postures, reducing their responsiveness, and becoming more difficult to rouse. They also show something researchers have described as a homeostatic sleep pressure, meaning that if they are prevented from resting, they subsequently rest more deeply, exhibiting a kind of sleep debt and recovery that mirrors the pattern seen in mammals. Some studies have suggested that sleep-deprived bees perform less accurately on tasks that require learned behaviors, hinting at a relationship between rest and memory in insects as well. Whether insects dream, in any sense we might attach to that word, is a question so far beyond our current tools and understanding that it would be unwise to even gesture toward an answer. But the presence of rest states, sleep pressure, and behavioral consequences of disrupted rest in animals whose nervous systems are so profoundly different from our own adds yet another layer to the picture we have been building. It suggests, once more, that rest is not an invention of complexity. It is not a reward that nervous systems earn once they become elaborate enough. It appears to be something closer to a requirement, present in some form wherever there is a nervous system at all, however simple, however small. And so we arrive, at the end of this chapter, at a picture that is both simpler and more surprising than the one most people carry when they think about sleep. It is not a mammalian invention. It is not a feature of large brains or warm blood or complex social lives. Though all of these things shape the particular form it takes, it appears in some recognizable form in reptiles, in fish, in insects, in creatures whose entire nervous system fits within a space no larger than a grain of rice. The specific mechanisms differ, the architecture varies, the depth of what is happening and whether anything is experienced remains in most of these cases completely unknown. But the pattern is there, cycling, resting, recovering, ancient and quiet and continuous across an almost unimaginable range of living things. A lizard, still on its warm rock, its tiny brain moving through rhythms older than the rock itself. A fish hovering motionless above the riverbed, its waveforms shifting slowly in the dark water. A honeybee folded and still on a leaf, somewhere in the summer night, its antennae drooping, its million neurons doing something that looks, in its own small way, remarkably like rest. And behind all of them, behind every twitching paw and rehearsed song and divided hemisphere and shifting skin, behind every spiraling seal and logging whale and resting reptile, behind every creature we have visited tonight, the same thread, pulling gently through the fabric of the living world. We set out tonight to ask a simple question. Can animals dream? And we have arrived, as careful science often does, not at a single clean answer, but at something richer, a pattern, ancient and wide and endlessly varied in its expression. A cycling that appears wherever nervous systems appear. A quiet alternation between stillness and activity, between depth and lightness, between rest and something that is not quite rest. Present in a lizard on a rock, present in a fish on a riverbed, present in a bee on a leaf, present in a rat retracing a maze, present in a finch rehearsing a song, present in a dolphin rising slow toward the surface, present in you, here, now. The questions remain open. They may always remain open, at least in part. And that is not a failure of science. It is an honest reflection of how deep this goes, how far back this reaches, how much of the living world is still, even now, quietly beyond our full understanding. What we can say with confidence is this: every creature that has ever rested, every nervous system that has ever cycled between deep and light, every brain that has ever replayed the footsteps of the day in the small hours of the night, has been participating in something that began long before any of us arrived, something that will continue long after, a rhythm so old it has no clear beginning, so wide it has no clear edge, so fundamental that life, wherever it appears, seems to carry it forward without being asked. Tonight, you are part of that continuity, not observing it from outside, but living it, as you have every night of your life, as creatures have in one form or another, for longer than we can easily hold in mind. Let the lizard rest on its rock. Let the fish hover in its dark water. Let the bee fold its wings against the leaf. Let the dog's paw twitch once and settle. Let the bird hold its quiet watch with one open eye, then slowly let that eye close too. Let the dolphin rise toward the surface, breathe and sink again. Let all of it continue gently, steadily, in the dark, and let yourself rest now within the same ancient rhythm that holds all of them, unhurried, unworried, simply cycling as living things have always cycled through the long, quiet hours of the night. Good night.